Well, now let's turn to Tom Farrell. Tom has got a little different subject for us this evening. I hope you enjoy it. Tom, welcome.
Thank you again for having me. Yes, tonight's going to be a little different. I'm going to talk about O scale and about ON30 and the origins of some of these scales, and a little history of things. And, we jokingly refer to ourselves as the black sheep of model railroading that comes from the gauge that ON30 is. And I'll explain some of the origins of that. And anyway, we're going to dive right into this. So everybody's probably familiar with this. It's almost a cliche to see this graphic now. You've got G scale, O scale, S scale, HO, so forth and so on. This is the ratio, and this is the width between the rails. We're all familiar with these. Tonight, I'm going to go into the history of O scale very briefly, and then talk about narrow gauge, and then a pioneer of or why ON30 is so popular today. I think you'll find it interesting, and the product's offerings. So O scale is actually 125 years old. It was introduced by Märklin. That's the correct pronunciation. I speak German. Märklin also invented HO gauge, and they invented N gauge as well as O gauge. I didn't know that till I did my research here. Lionel adopted O gauge in 1906. And I think everybody's familiar with Lionel. This is the early beginnings of commercial model trains across the world, but we're going to talk about the US. What's referred to as the golden age of model railroading, as far as O scale is concerned, is the pre-war stuff, 1920s, 1940s. It was the biggest scale, primarily led by Lionel. And towards the closer we got to World War II, there was a shift from the tin plate to cast and stamped trains that were more realistic than the printed tin plate. Apparently, Lionel still made trains during World War II, but obviously slowed down their production. It became the dominant scale, though, by the end of the 1940s. Post-war in the 50s and 60s, it was still popular, but HO was introduced. And I think everybody knows HO is the largest scale today. But O scale still retained its fans because it's considered the modeler's scale, because it's much easier to get detail the larger you go. And it transitioned from that period from basically toy trains to Lionel and some others, American Flyer, kept adding more detail and brought them up from toy trains to hobby grade models. So they started to shift their marketing emphasis by the late 1960s to hobbyists. And then what's considered the Renaissance period is a renewed interest in O gauge as a collector's item. People began collecting these die-cast Lionel trains, and then around 1998, Bachmann introduced ON30 trains, which were basically O scale trains, narrow gauge, that ran on HO track. And they also had a dedicated following amongst scratch builders and kit bashers and people that appreciate detail and freewheeling modeling. Then I consider the modern era in model railroading, when things started to get very interesting with electronics and things. And Lionel caters almost exclusively to high-end collectors. I mean, look at that locomotive. For anybody that might think Lionel makes toys, that's a $2,600 toy that does everything. In fact, it actually does talk to you. I mean, it's an amazing piece of technology and modeling. Modern O scale, basically standard gauge. We refer to 3-rail or high rail on new tracks. And then there's O scale 2-rail. Now, here's an interesting thing. When Märklin brought this stuff over, it wasn't quite O scale, it was approximate. And this carried through over 100 years because there's actually 1.25 inches between the rails, which is actually 5 feet between the rails. And as anybody knows, the prototype is actually 4 feet, 8.5 inches. So I find it amusing that people sometimes in standard O gauge refer to On30 with no basis in prototypes, which it actually does, when in fact for over 120 years, they're out of scale. And that's the reason for Proto 48, which is also referred to as fine scale. It actually measures out to 4 feet, 8.5. Anyway, that is the standard gauge and the history of standard gauge and how we come to our 1.25 inch track for O scale today, and why these guys, the Proto 48s guys, have their own little diatribe to bring that back to scale. Now, common narrow gauge O scales divided into principally ON3, ON30, and O18. There are other gauges, narrow gauges in there, but these are the most popular. What's interesting is ON30 refers to 30 inches or 2 feet, 1.5 between the rails. And this is because it's the whole idea of ON30 was to be based on HO scale track, which scales out to be 30 inches in O scale. ON3 is 0.75 inches between the rails, and it's 36 inches between the rails. That's the gauge. Technically, in the beginning of ON30, they called it ON 2.5 as a nod to ON3. So that what's happening here is you're mixing inches with feet as far as naming these gauges. You could say that ON30, 30 inches. You could say that ON3 is really ON36. And then finally, you've got ON18, which is 18 inches between the gauge or between the track. And that uses N gauge track, which is 9 millimeters, which scales out to 1 foot 6 inches. So basically, the confusion is when they introduced ON30, they had a choice to call it ON 2.5, which would be a 2.5 feet, which would be a nod to the ON3, which is 3 foot. And then they could have called ON18 ON 1.5. One thing that's going on here is ON30 and ON18 are the popular gauges, and ON3 is basically dying. These are people that like to model in O scale, narrow gauge, turn to ON30 because, as you'll see, the dearth of relatively inexpensive locomotives. You don't have to buy brass locomotives like the ON3. And it just opened up the hobby to many modelers that would like to run narrow gauge, but couldn't quite frankly afford ON3. And just a nod to Steve Sherrill, ON18 is basically becoming very popular. Anyway, So where'd it come from? Back in the 50s, I did a little research here. People actually did use HO gauge wheels and locomotive chassis and HO gauge track. Nobody really does this anymore. You do use a lot of people that kit bash will use an HO locomotive chassis, but nobody's really taking HO gauge wheel sets, putting them on locomotives. There's plenty of On30 wheel sets for freight cars, kit bashing, and scratch building. This guy, Gordon North, he did an article back in a couple of these guys, Bill Livingston and Gordon North. I don't know if any of you guys know these guys. I was going to look up the magazine article because I do have these things, but I didn't have time. Bachmann in 1998 is the one that really got ON30 going. They came out with a Mogul, a 260 steam locomotive for their Christmas Village market. And it sold incredible numbers. And at one time, ON30 was considered the fastest growing segment of model railroading in the US. And it even got other manufacturers to offer some locomotives. The guy that led the party here for ON30 passed away in 2016, this fella, Lee Riley. And a couple of you guys actually know this guy. Now, I'm not going to read his resume here, but this guy was like the who's who of model railroading. He was quite a guy. And if I can find more research on him, I'll do a legacy program like I did for Judy. But he was a real pioneer. And he drove ON30 within Bachmann. He was the product champion which is the largest model railroad company in the world. I didn't realize Bachmann was. I thought Märklin or Lionel might be, but Bachmann is actually the largest. And this guy was a dynamo, just a real dynamo. Another guy that pushed ON30 was Judy. And I don't need to go into this because just recently I did his legacy program. But Al was probably took, if you will, the reins to push this ON30 onward. And we're going to maintain that legacy, as everyone knows. But with Al's shows and things and all his many articles and his ON30 railroading Facebook page that I run, we're pushing the ON30 on into the future here. What's neat about ON30, for those of you that may or may not know, is it fits conveniently in between HO scale and standard O scale. So it gives you basically all the advantages of HO. Your layout is, in essence, the same radius or less as HO scale model railroading, but significantly less space required for standard O scale. Yet when you build your buildings and you're doing your modeling, it's not an exercise in fine optics. It's considered a builder scale. I want everybody to know that some of the finest modelers in the hobby today are the ON30 crew. Just this evening, we saw that two of the presentations were ON30 guys. And at the recent Pittsburgh National Convention in Model Railroading, I'm thinking more than half of the contest winners were ON30. So it's really the modeler scale. And it's just easier to work in O scale than the other scales. Now, just to clear up, yes, you can run on HO track. There it is up there. It's the same gauge. Gauge means the width of the rails, between the rails, the outside of the rails. But you see the tie spacing is rather close in HO for our O scale needs. These are the two commercial manufacturers of track, Pico, ON30, and Micro Engineering. there's the ongoing debate. Microengineering's a better looking track. The Pico track's more durable. I've used both. I personally like the Pico. It's indestructible. It's very durable. But that shows you some people do use HO track. Al Judy's layout used HO track, and nobody ever threw disparaging remarks against his modeling, although on his rebuild of his layout before he passed, he was replacing this HO track with the Pico track, citing the durability of this track. It's just very well made. Here's an HO tank car, just to put things in perspective. It's a little over 6 inches in length. Here's an ON30 tank car. It's approximately 7 inches in length. Now, these are all, tank cars can be various lengths, but I just want to put things in perspective. And I want to point out the difference between ON3 and ON30. This is a brass, highly detailed ON3 car that I have that I've put ON30 trucks on, but it doesn't really work too well in ON30. It's 9 inches in length. It's big. This is why we need to talk about proportions. So even though our ON30 runs on HO track, it's not HO scale. It's runs on HO gauge track, but has nothing in common with the scale. It's still twice as big scale-wise, proportionately, than HO. And ON30, even though it's O scale, these cars are bigger. I also have a box car in ON3, and it's approximately the length of this tank car. They don't look right together, the ON3 and the ON30 running side by side. ON3 is simply proportion larger. And this particular tank car is rather crude. There are a lot of scale ON30 freight cars and passenger cars. There gives you an idea that we're talking proportions. So there's the end shot of an HO tank car, an ON30 tank car, and then the ON3 tank car. Disregarding the chassis they're sitting on, look at the actual fabrications, the tanks. See the diameters? That gives you a good idea. I've found that you can't run ON3 with ON30. It just doesn't seem to look right. It's a proportion issue. ON30 gauge steam locomotives. Now we can thank Lee Riley for all these locomotives that are available to us from Bachmann and a couple others. This mogul, they produce Bachmann. I don't know what the production numbers are. Maybe somebody knows them out there in our audience, but they produced this mogul by the thousands. Now it's a relatively low detail locomotive, but the mechanism is indestructible. I had this on my old layout. I must have had, I don't know if I had a dozen of them, but I had at least 10 DC versions of this mogul. They just ran and ran and ran. And on my new rustic buff and old Gothic, I have 2 new moguls from Bachmann that are digital command control with sound. And they upgraded the mechanism to put in metal gears. So now the thing is really indestructible. And if you want a kit bash, this offers an excellent chassis. And you can detail this. You can throw off all this plastic injection molded lights and things, and you can add your own. I mean, you can do a lot with this and make it a very presentable model. This is the first and early ON30 from Bachmann, and it was meant for basically to run around Christmas trees. So it had adequate but not great detail. The subsequent models that Lee pushed through the very large Bachmann company are basically magnificent. They're die cast, they're gorgeous models. I'll show you about a half a dozen of them. I don't know the full count. It's not a great photograph, but heads and shoulders over the mogul in detail here. There's a Bachmann 240. He had a large variety of what you might consider, compared to standard gauge, oddball locomotives. And some of them had more detail than others, but there's a huge variety, and they produce so many of these out there. You can find them on eBay, you can find them new at shows. There's just tens of thousands of these out there. Another one that's very clean, very nice, a 2442, really oddball locomotive. Another one from the 1890s, inside frame, American wood cab. Again, these can be weathered, and that doesn't have bad detail, but none of these are weathered. These are just stock photos off the internet. This is a 460. This is die cast, by the way. And they made little porters too. They also have a little diesel at the same similar size, 042. Lee, it was the reason this became such a popular scale for model railroaders. There's a 2-truck Stearns Hessler. We just call it a Hessler. And a 2-truck Climax. Now remember, these things are, a brass locomotive would cost you at least $600 on the used market. New, these were a couple $100. You can find them on the eBay for that in DCC. Other manufacturers produced models for On30 models for the U.S. market. Mountain Model Imports, MMI, I guess they're no longer in business, or they quit making these. But this is a museum piece. It's also priced like one. It's expensive, but it's On30, and it's also available in ON3. This quality locomotive was all that was available in ON3. You had to buy these brass locomotives or these metal works of art. They were a couple thousand or $1,500. It negated the scale being practiced on a wide basis. Broadway Limited, they came out with this C16 280. I have 5 of these. 2 of them don't work. I get mixed. Some people love this locomotive. Some people, Judy thought it was not exactly of the highest quality. It came equipped with only as digital DCC with sound. They can be super detailed. The one thing I don't like about these, and why 2 of mine are dead, is they have a plastic gear. And I'm not aware of anybody that makes a replacement metal gear. The price of these have gone up significantly on eBay. I can't believe the pricing they're getting for these. It's not even in the same league as what's above here. And there's some other people that make. San Juan Car Company, they make kits and ready to run. I caught a European here, wagons, freight cars. How'd that get in there? And then Accucraft, I guess they make some brass engines, but I'm not sure they still do. I want people to start thinking of ON30 as the modeler scale, because as we saw tonight with Matt and Martin and some others that model in ON30, you can do a lot with O scale And the narrow gauge ON30 gives you the footprint of an HO layout. So people often say, well, S scale is nice because it's large and it's, approximately the same size as ON30, but we have a lot more advantages. Our locomotives are, if you're into steam, we have a much wider variety. And we have the ability to use HO track if you want. There's a scale for everybody's need. I start out with N scale in 1967. It only came over here in the US in 65. I modeled N scale to 2005. There's no one scale that's better than the other. Every scale has its advantages. The only thing I'm saying about ON30 is it does give you the ability to model in the same space as HO with the ability to scratch build or build things in O scale, which is easier. The bigger it gets, the easier it is. This is my latest layout and my latest scene I'm working on. It's another scene from my latest railroad, my John Allen engine house. And there's a heavily kit bashed Broadway limited C16. So this is what I'm talking about. You can do with these models. When I purchased this Broadway limited C16, it was only like 150 bucks. And I put this whaleback tender on it and added all this stuff, a bell and some other stuff. And you can super detail them quite easily and quite inexpensively. Again, the modeler scale. Because you're an O scale, things are just easier, in my opinion. This is Al Judy. The detail you can achieve with ON30. It's O scale. Al Judy again, this is a kit. Nice scene. I took the photograph. Len Eberwein, one of the finest model railroaders that you kit or scratch builders that you've never heard of. I have this now. He gave it to me. This is a turn of the century oil distillery. A magnificent detail that you can achieve in O scale. Len was an ON30 modeler. That's hand carved balsa foam, scratch built doors out of styrene. Everything there is scratch built. Another Len Eberwein, Coal Depot. Randy Peprock, downtown Deco, has these cast plaster buildings. Again, because it's O scale, you can have a lot of detail. There's an ON30 Bachmann Shea by this fella, Stan Shields. Try and get him on the show. This is a work in progress. I pulled it off the ON30 railroading page this evening. Impossible to do in N scale. Not impossible in HO or S, but far easier than in O scale. And then if you want to go off and to do completely your own thing, a lot of you people know Gary Beatty, the Porto Baracho Railroad. He and I recently exchanged structures. This is just fantastic, whimsical modeling. So with ON30, since we're not, quote, rivet counters, and you have a license to do basically what you want, that's world-class modeling there. Just absolutely world-class. So as I say, we call ourselves the black sheep because there aren't a lot of prototypes that are actually 30 inches, but that doesn't bother us. This was an alternative to ON3, which were brass locomotives with finicky mechanisms that didn't run well and were quite expensive. And ON30 became the fastest growing segment model railroading because of the relatively inexpensive locomotives that were basically bulletproof. They had issues with some of them early on, but they fixed them. Anyway, a little overview of On30, difference between scale and gauge, and where all these things came from.